Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Center for New Liberalism. If you'd like to support us, you can do so in two ways. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. You can also become a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. That's cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Members get a bunch of benefits like access to exclusive podcast episodes, access to our community Slack, and the ability to join their local chapters. Become a member today, support the Center for New Liberalism, and support the podcast. And thanks for listening. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and this week we're talking about the coming civil war in the Republican Party. Now, the midterms we've discussed. We talked about that with Sarah Payton, who's our political director at PPI, but most of that is from the perspective of Democrats. You know, and that makes sense. Sarah's a Democrat. I'm a Democrat. We work for a think tank that's aligned with the Democratic Party. And there's a lot of interesting things to take away from the midterms, specifically about the Democratic Party. But it wouldn't do to forget what's going on with the Republican Party. The Republican Party did win control of the House, although in a much, much less impressive fashion than they wanted to. And there are real questions coming out of the midterms about where the Republican Party goes from here. Is it technically a success that they took control of one of the houses of Congress? Is it a failure? And all of these questions lead back to what's going on with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has announced that he is running for president in 2024, but perhaps for the first time, real significant movement seems to be happening in the party to discourage him from doing that and to basically say enough is enough. Now, we've kind of seen this before, and there's a question of whether or not that's real or not, whether or not anybody will really stand up to him. And that's the subject of today's podcast. Joining us is Tim Miller. Tim is a writer at The Bulwark. He is the host of the Not My Party feature on Snapchat. He's the author of Why We Did It, which is a book about his road as a Republican and ultimately away from the current iteration of the Republican Party. And he's joining us to talk about this upcoming potential civil war between Trump and anti-Trump factions in the GOP and how we got here and what might happen. So, Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, man, it's good to be back. Hello, Neolibs.
Great to have you as always. I got to ask, we'll just start super general. What was your takeaway from the midterm results? With everything mostly having come in now, we've still got the Georgia runoff, but what are you taking away from this? What are your headlines?
To me, I think the biggest headline is the more MAGA, the more you dabbled in the election conspiracy, the worse you did. And so I just think that I don't want that to get lost from this whole process. I think that we were facing some pretty real threats, when it comes to democracy. I think a lot of us never Trumpers, sometimes we get finger wagged by people who are telling us we're catastrophizing or whatever over the state of affairs when it comes to democracy. But I don't think that we were. I think that we're lucky that we will never now know what a 2024 election where Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona are all run by people that dabbled in or went full bore in the Trump coup attempt, what that would have ended up looking like. I think that would have been a pretty scary prospect. And they got swept. I think the Wisconsin is your prime example of this. Look at Ron Johnson and Tim Michels are not meaningfully different. Maybe you could argue that Tony Evers and Mandela Barnes are meaningfully different, but Mandela Barnes was Tony Evers' lieutenant governor. And yet you see Ron Johnson win narrowly and Tony Evers win narrowly. And I think that was just your encapsulation of the big takeaway from the night, which is on the issues of democracy and abortion, where candidates were in a position to where enough voters were concerned about their radicalism to make a difference, they made the difference, and they bailed on the GOP. And so I think that is your top line takeaway. I think there are obviously other takeaways, but I think that was the most encouraging thing. And why not focus on the nice parts here around Thanksgiving? Something to be grateful for.
It's always nice to have something to be thankful for. And I think you're right. I think every election denying attorney general, there were 5 or 6 of them, and they all lost.
Secretary of State.
Secretaries of State. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, secretaries of state of states. A tricky position to be in, rhetorically, verbally, but also you could point to Kerry Lake in Arizona and Mastriano, I think, in Pennsylvania, and just kind of the real crazy, I don't know, election deniers, what Mitch McConnell would have called well, there are some issues with candidate quality, but you saw basically all those people lose, right?
Yeah, and it was a total sweep. If you're now, some election deniers won in Alabama and Wyoming and whatnot, right? But if you just go across the board, the Secretary of State's races, the contested ones, it was a total sweep. And if you look at even congressional races, the 2 that stand out, there were impeachers, people that impeached Trump: Jamie Herrera Butler in Washington and Peter Meyer in Michigan. Both were primaried by election deniers. Both lost their primary. And both election deniers then went on to lose the general election. In the case of the Washington seat, Joe Kent, that was a pretty safe Republican seat, actually, that they gave up. And then if you look at the governor's races, pretty much the same story. Maybe you consider there's an exception in Nevada, though that governor, Lombardo, that ran in Nevada, dabbled in the lightest possible way, with election denial. And I think everybody kind of assumed that he was, a private normie. So not to give him any props for that. I think he was a category difference, though, than, the way that Tim Michels in Wisconsin and Mastriano and Lake acted. And in all of those competitive governor's races, they were swept out. And I think abortion, I mentioned that, it's hard to disentangle that, right? Especially when you consider in a lot of these states, the abortion laws were really on the ballot, right? And literally in Michigan with the ballot initiative. But, if you're in Wisconsin with a Republican legislature, the difference between Tony Evers as governor and Tim Michels as governor, could be radically different abortion laws, right? That wasn't really the case in some blue states where I think you saw Republicans do better. Where I am in California, where you are in New York, Republicans did a little better than expected. And I think partly because there wasn't any legitimate concerns that, the winners of those races would have control over, supporting a Donald Trump coup or, banning abortion at week 1 with no exceptions. Right. So, it's a little hard to disentangle those two, but I think working in concert together, it was a total. So there isn't really even a bright spot for the election deniers. And I guess you would say J.D. Vance winning in the Senate in Ohio, but he did 13 points worse than Mike DeWine running for governor, right? So it still wasn't good. It's just a sign that Ohio is just going very deep red. And I think that would be, the most concerning signs. My other big takeaway for the Democrats is on a really good night, Ohio and Florida, 2 traditional swing states in our lifetime, being completely off the map for Democrats now isn't great, looking ahead to 2024.
Let's talk about that specifically, because it was a good night for Democrats relative to expectations, but there are a couple places where Republicans overperformed. In New York State, in Ohio, potentially, certainly in Florida. Do you think that there's a unifying theme of why particular Republicans did well, even as the party as a whole did not have the night they wanted?
Yeah. Well, the blue state theme is unifying in that I think that there were, like I just said, some of the threats of extremism didn't feel as real, I don't think, if you're voting in a congressional race in New York, for example. I think that maybe, some of the blue state overreach on COVID had a little bit more salience as a message in a place like New York and California. So I think that is kind of one example that maybe the threats of the Republican extremism didn't feel quite as threatening. I'm a wordsmith, and the and some of the Democrats overreach and crime also, felt a little bit more real. So I think that is one example of the blue state phenomenon. I think that then you take Ohio and Florida and put that in a different category. I just think these are states that have been moving in the Republicans' direction for a while now, and the dam has broken. I think that there's something to be said for the fact that DeSantis and DeWine, were incumbent governors. People felt like the state was, going the right direction. They didn't feel like these people were going to be part of a Donald Trump coup per se. That said, both enacted very extreme policies, right? So if your unifying theory of the election is the Republicans were punished for extremism, well, Ohio put in place a very extreme abortion bill, that caused people to have to leave the state, after I think it was 5 weeks. I'm going from memory. DeSantis had a more modest abortion bill, 15 weeks. Still a pretty big change from the current law, and then
that's something that, some people have pointed to that as actually a sign of moderation on the part of Ron DeSantis. And maybe if you are pro-choice, you obviously think that any restriction on abortion is a bad thing. But some people have pointed to 15 weeks as kind of like this really smart triangulation. Like you do that, and then you don't move any further, and that's actually a reasonably popular position, because I don't know, people are addicted to compromise or something like that.
And I think that's right. But that said, Ron DeSantis ran as a Trump disciple. He did sending Texas asylees, using taxpayer dollars to send asylees in Texas to Massachusetts for no reason that's relevant to Florida. I passed the Don't Say Gay bill. My point is that I think that you have to come to terms when assessing the election with the fact that, like, in certain places, Republicans were not punished for their extremism. What would be the answer for that? And I think it's that we've seen Florida and Ohio move significantly in the Republicans' direction. Part of that are just the trends, non-college whites moving towards Republicans inexorably. Part of it, though, is if you look at Florida, I think the big question is why Miami-Dade, made such a dramatic change. And, to that, maybe you need to have Mark Caputo on the podcast or something. That's something I still need to spend more time trying to understand myself. Early in the night, I think there was a sense that it was a signal that the Hispanic vote had continued its move towards the Republicans that we saw a little bit of in 2020. But that didn't really bear out in Arizona and Nevada, on the border in Texas. Some movement, very slight, better than maybe the Republicans were doing in 2016. But nothing like what happened in Miami-Dade happened anywhere else in the country, and so that does just feel like an outlier. But just really quick, the 2024 ramifications of this, I think, are very serious, though, because if you're a Democrat, you won narrowly in what are now the key swing states: Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin. You are 3 for 4 in the Senate, 4 for 4 if you include governor's races and add in Michigan. But all of those were pretty close, right? So Democrats are winning narrowly in key swing states, while Republicans move 2 swing states off the map. That just makes the electoral math a little bit more challenging for Democrats going into 2024 than it had been, maybe 2 cycles ago.
Yeah, and there's this question of whether or not Democrats and Republicans have the same dynamic as they used to during off-cycle elections. It used to be conventional wisdom that Republicans had a little bit of an edge because, not as many people vote, older electorate, Republicans win with old people. But now it seems like it's more, there's this countervailing theory. Well, Democrats are actually now the party of educated people, and educated people vote more often, and they're more likely to vote in low turnout elections. And maybe it's Democrats who have the edge now. And I don't know if you can prove this theory one way or the other, but
I don't know about Democrats having the edge. Just really quick, I think there's something to be said, though, for the fact that while the Democrats, this trade that had happened, I wrote about this for The Bulwark, where Democrats get what I call red dog Democrats, which are basically me, suburban former Republicans, and Republicans get kind of working class whites and some working class Latinos, culturally conservative. This trade really hurt the Democrats in a lot of ways politically, because the map, over our system, both the Senate and the Electoral College gives additional weight basically to rural and working class whites. And in a weird way, in the midterms and in the House, this kind of worked against Republicans actually, because for two reasons. One was, like you said, I think that you get a higher turnout, that like these college educated, mostly whites, but not entirely, that have switched, are more reliable voters that the Democrats picked up. But then secondly, Republicans are now starting to see what this inefficiency in the makeup of their coalition and the ways that it hurt Democrats for a while, where all the Democrats are packed into cities, and so you have a lot of wasted votes, so to speak, right? Because if you're winning 80-18, it'd be nice to have some of those people in a more of a swing district. But Republicans are now seeing this in rural America, right, too, where they're getting a lot of wasted votes, and so they did, better in a raw vote than they had in some past midterms, but the votes didn't help them because it wasn't in the swing districts.
I'm looking up the national House vote, just like by total population, and Republicans have gotten about 54 million votes, and Democrats about 50.5 million. It's like 51% to 47.5%, and so like Republicans have got a solid 3.5 point lead in the national House vote, but it's not enough for them to have more than just the tiniest of edges.
That'll come down a little as California comes in, because California takes forever to count. But even still, yeah, they'll have a clear popular. House popular vote has all kinds of problems, but just as a general rule of thumb, yeah, it's notable that Republicans will have an advantage, and it will give them a very narrow majority.
So I want to talk about Ron DeSantis. DeSantis is probably going to be one of the main characters of politics in the United States for the next couple of years. Regardless of whatever Trump does or doesn't do, DeSantis is kind of being pitched as Trumpism without Trump, and he seems like the most likely unifying force. We can talk about some of the other people who are clearly signaling they also want to run. I'm not sure if they matter, but they certainly think they matter, so they're going to try. But DeSantis seems to be, especially in a night when it seems like election denial lost, the closer you were to Trump, the more poorly you performed. And DeSantis is virtually the only bright spot. Florida is virtually the only bright spot for the Republican Party. Do you think that basic intuition is correct? Is like DeSantis going to be the rallying cry for everyone in the Republican Party who's just kind of tired of Donald Trump?
For sure. And this was happening for a while. Over at The Bulwark, we have a focus group podcast my colleague Sarah Longwell does, and it's just what it sounds like, voter focus groups. And one of the groups we really talk to a lot are MAGA voters, just to make sure we're not in our little coastal elite bubbles. And one thing that was clear as early as spring of this year was that like DeSantis was kind of the national figure that would come up. She, in these MAGA focus groups, she'd ask people, who else besides Trump would you like for 2024? DeSantis would always get mentioned universally in the groups. People liked him. So he has this base that he started from, where I think he was seen as the most credible alternative, and he would have been a clear favorite had Donald Trump, had the magic, well done steak that ended the Trump era. So I think that benefited him. There was his absurd, Martha's Vineyard, absurd, bigoted, whatever word you want to use, gambit. Was something that got brought up when I was traveling the country a bunch the last few weeks. I was guest hosting the circus on Showtime, and at these Republican events I go to in other states, like in Arizona, Carrie Lake would like mention it, or Blake Masters would mention it, or people would mention it when you're going to other states. So he gained this kind of little credibility with the Republican base from that move. And so I think that he was in a good position to benefit from this. And then the election results just like came up totally DeSantis, right? And he hit an inside straight as far as him doing as well as he did. And these Trump candidates, it could have been a mixed night very easily, right? The national popular vote moved 1 point the other direction. I mean, some of these races were quite close. Carrie Lake was quite close. I think we're in a totally different world if that happens. So I think that he's well positioned and really the only logical other person besides Trump, assuming that he wants to do it. I think that there are a lot of questions ahead about whether he is capable of that. But yeah, I mean he's clearly the person.
One of the things that's interesting to me is that DeSantis seems to be going like all in on culture war kind of politics. And it's very clear, like you said, he's shipping migrants up to liberal northeastern states as kind of a stunt, the don't say gay stuff in Florida and like fear mongering over LGBT people. And all that's what he's going in on. And he's very blatant about it. He's not hiding what he's doing. He's proud of it. He wants to play the culture war. But it seems to me like he's actually been quite strategic about which culture war topics he wants to hit. Like, he does not talk about abortion very much. They passed the 15-week ban, but there's, as far as I know, his office is not pushing for like more extreme abortion measures. And he has really not played the election denial game, in terms of saying that the 2020 election was stolen. And it seems like he's trying to figure out like which culture war stuff can I like legitimately win on and which culture war stuff might drag me down. And I wonder if he's kind of had a better instinct on this than Donald Trump does, because Trump had better political instincts than a lot of people remember, in 2016 when he went all in on culture war stuff, but declined to say like, I want to cut Social Security, I want to cut Medicare. The whole Paul Ryan vision of the GOP got tossed in the trash when Trump was like, I love Social Security. I'm going to protect your Social Security. And also illegal immigrants are rapists. Like that, it seems like that was the message a significant part of the country wanted to hear in 2016. But now I'm left kind of wondering, has Trump lost that mojo of like, what do people want to hear because of his personal grievances about the election or whatever? And has DeSantis got that?
I think that is what Rummy would call a known unknown at this point. I think that DeSantis has been, I agree with your assessment of DeSantis's strategic moves to date. And as gross as I found the migrant shipping stunt, and as gross as I found the don't say gay personally, the numbers kind of bore out that it didn't really harm him. And there were some Democrats, I had some friends that thought it was actually kind of smart because it shifted the conversation on cultural war issues into an area where Republicans were on sturdier ground than abortion and election denial.
Yeah. And we should say we're not supporting this, but it's, you have to be able to remove yourself from your own views and figure out what is going to appeal to people, even if you think it's abhorrent or terrible.
Exactly. So here's the two caveats I'd put on that. Number one, you get to pick your spots when you're the governor. Right? You don't have to vote on stuff in the Senate. You get to set your own agenda. If the news calls and says, hey, I want your opinion on this crazy thing that Donald Trump said, you don't have to weigh in if you don't want to. You can pick in the press conference, which issue, you're going to respond to because you have control over the narrative. You don't get to do that as much in a presidential campaign. Right. And is Ron DeSantis going to be deft enough to avoid all of these Donald Trump sand traps ahead of him? I'm skeptical of that, right? Like if you're running a campaign against Donald Trump and Donald Trump is running on all these more unpopular culture issues, is he gonna differentiate from Trump on that, or is he gonna end up getting sucked into it? And I kind of think the latter, right? And it seems like DeSantis is going to try to take a posture where he doesn't want to give Trump any inch on the right. And I think now that takes us to my second thing about how deft he's been is, does that play nationally? I think this big question that we have when you're looking at this election is Florida an outlier because Florida has gotten more red, by the nature of the coalition shift? Or is Florida an outlier because Ron DeSantis was more politically deft than other Republicans? And I kind of think it's the former. I don't know that what Ron DeSantis is selling would have sold that well in Michigan against Gretchen Whitmer. Like, was it that different than what Tudor Dixon did? I guess. I mean, Tudor Dixon sucked up to Trump a little bit more than DeSantis did, but not in his reelection. I mean, in his first election, he was just on Trump's balls, but not that much more, right? I mean, was he that much more deft? And I mean, certainly he's more deft than Mastriano, right? Who ran like an insane Christian nationalist campaign. But was he that more deft than Oz? I went to see Oz at the end of the campaign, a couple of his events, and he was not going down the Trump rabbit hole on abortion or on election denial. He was offering a pretty mainstream message, but he got tarred by the whole brand of the GOP in a state where that stuff isn't selling. So I just the two things that I'm the most bearish on DeSantis is, can he go toe to toe to Trump and still maintain a brand that's distinguished and unique from him without losing altitude with either the MAGA or the normie Republicans? And then if he defeats Trump, is he going to be differentiated enough to appeal to these voters that were the key voters in this election that crossed over and voted for Democrats, when they thought the Republican was too scary? I think that both of those are really big challenges ahead for him.
One thing that I can already tell is going to happen, and it's going to drive me fucking crazy, is that DeSantis is going to be labeled as like the more moderate Trump. This is going to happen in the mainstream press. If it's going to enrage you out there listening, you need to prepare yourself for it. This will happen. And, just because Trump is clearly an insane person and DeSantis is probably more sane and rational than Trump in a lot of ways, he's going to be branded as more moderate. But I think you're right. And the Democrats' challenge.
In a lot of ways, he's probably more conservative. Like, this term is just the way how we define conservatism and moderate, and like Trump is just.
Well, for 6 years, conservatism has just been loyalty to Trump,
right?
Basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's no world in which, in 2015, in which you look at Liz Cheney and Elise Stefanik and you say Elise Stefanik is more conservative, right? Because she wasn't. She was a moderate across the board. She was probably pretty in line with the Neoliberal Podcast listeners on a lot of things. Climate change and gay marriage and globalism on immigration and internationalism on foreign affairs. And then she just flipped and went full MAGA, right? So, in a lot of ways, I'm sure Trump will zag on, like you said, on Social Security, on abortion, maybe even on some of these issues.
This is what I want to know about DeSantis is like, he's going to successfully, or to this point, he has successfully tried to just like everything is about illegal immigration and culture war, LGBT stuff. And like, he's never had to take a stance on like, what would he do with Social Security?
Right.
Does he want to cut Medicare? Like the Paul Ryan questions, Trump actually answered those and just defied conservative orthodoxy. And I kind of suspect DeSantis is more like a traditional conservative in that he would actually like to kind of gut those programs and provide tax cuts for the rich, and that's his economic agenda. But it's the Democrats' job to actually make him say that at some point if he's running for president. So
and foreign policy, right? I mean, where is he on? Is he going to be sucked into Tucker Carlson world on Ukraine and Hungary, or is he going to try to run on a foreign policy that looks like what Rubio ran on in 2016? Just a ton of open questions for him that don't have obvious good answers, right? And
if you're him, if you're DeSantis, you want to go as long as possible without having to answer any of these questions. If you can make it through like halfway of the primary season and you've already defined what the election is going to be about, and you haven't had to really answer any tough questions about foreign policy or tax cuts or Medicare, like that's fantastic. That's your game plan.
And here's the thing, and this is, I guess, now gets to the question of how much of Trump's fastball has he lost? Because I totally agree with you that he, had more of his finger on the pulse of what, your average, particularly MAGA voter, but even sort of disaffected voter more broadly wanted in 2016. His own narcissism and megalomania about 2020 has got him out of step with that. But if you get into a primary, like as somebody who lived through this, to primary Donald Trump, he smells blood in the water, and assuming he still has that instinct, I find it very hard to believe that Trump is going to let Ron DeSantis not answer these questions. And, we haven't even mentioned some of the obvious ones. You kind of gave DeSantis credit for not dabbling in the election dialism.
You almost said there, I gave DeSantis to credit.
DeSantis to credit. DeSantis to future to credit on this. And kind of, right? I mean, he dabbled a little bit in November about the alternate elector theory on Fox one time, and then he kind of shut up about it. And that's not an option, running against Donald Trump. So is he going to say January 6th was a bad thing? Is he going to, say that Joe Biden won legitimately? Is he going right? And does he get crossways with Trump voters and find himself getting into Mike Pence territory? If he goes too far, does he get crossways with the very voters that just voted down Kari Lake and Doug Mastriano? If if he doesn't go far enough, right? I agree with you that silence and avoiding all this longer is better for him, but he's running against an opponent that makes that very challenging. And I think that it's not kind of like the old school of politics where these guys just kind of respect each other's boundaries until the last possible minute on this stuff. I think Trump will go in on him hard, and maybe DeSantis gets lucky and Trump just doesn't have it anymore because he's too obsessed with all the investigations going against him and the supposed 2020 fraud, and he just totally flames out. I think that's DeSantis' best case scenario. I don't think that's very likely, but it's a non-zero possibility.
So I want to get into like which factions of the party are going to have which reactions to this fight. It's a DeSantis versus Trump fight. There's different parts of the GOP and the conservative establishment and so forth. But before that, just quickly, do you think that there are any interlopers who could make this a more interesting race, who have a legitimate shot here? And I'll throw a couple names out there. Like Mike Pence is very clearly at least exploring a run. Nikki Haley has all but been broadcasting for the last decade practically that she wants to run for president. I don't know who her base is. I have no idea why this is happening, but it seems to be happening. And Rick Scott seems to have delusions of grandeur. I don't know what's going on with him. He seems to be flaming out. But are there any other contenders who you have your eye on, either the ones I listed or the ones I haven't listed, who could make this a more interesting race, more than just DeSantis versus Trump?
I think as long as DeSantis is in to win, I don't take anybody else seriously. If DeSantis decides to pass on this race for whatever reason, we've seen crazier things before, then maybe, you look at somebody like Mike Pompeo, who is also dabbling in this as a conceivable person. You try to think about who can bridge. So these two questions are related, right? The question you teased and this question. So I'll just take them both together, right? If you look at what the party's breakdown is, it's about, give or take, using round numbers, 10% at some level like actively dislikes Trump. 30% are always Trumpers. This is your Trump cult, people that show up to the rallies, the red hat. 60% is the most misunderstood group because they're barely represented in the commentariat. Actually like Trump, but, could be movable, right? Like DeSantis too. This is your Fox News viewer. Like, they're not in on the DC Beltway gamesmanship, right? Like, they're just, I'm just watching the five every day, and I like Ron DeSantis, and I like Trump, and I like Nikki Haley, and I like, they might not like Nikki Haley that much, but I like Mike Pompeo, right? Like, so who are the people who can attract those people, right? And so that person can't be positioned too far anti-Trump, and that's why DeSantis is in the sweet spot with them right now. Pence and Haley, they're in the sour spot, right? The 10% will go with them. 60%, maybe you can get some percentage of those people, but for a lot of them, they just went too far anti-Trump for their taste. That is unfair. That is crazy. But that is just perception is reality type situation. So is there someone else that could fill that void, besides DeSantis, Pompeo, I don't know, Cruz, he's extremely unlikable. Now you're getting into a bunch of retread territory. Which kind of takes me back to my original answer, which is there isn't really anybody.
Yeah, I'm skeptical because I don't know. I don't, when I look at like Nikki Haley or Mike Pompeo, I look at that and I think like, who is their base? Because it's good to be broadly acceptable to like a group, right? You want to be broadly acceptable to all the major constituencies. That's any candidate's ideal, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, is to be broadly acceptable to everybody. But also, you need to have a base. You need to have somebody who's going to make you stand out and get you that 15 to 20% right. That, in a poll that will make people take you seriously, and there starts to be a bandwagon that forms and you get momentum. And I look and like, who is Nikki Haley's 15%? Who's going to bat for Nikki Haley? Who's sticking their neck out for Mike Pompeo? Like, I don't see anybody.
Haley's base is like the 8. That's what I'm saying, that in that group of 10% of people that like are really bordering on hostile to Trump. Right? Like never Trumpers are not in the primary anymore. But even, somebody that's like think about the readership of like the Dispatch, right? It's a website I'm familiar with. It's like just more conservative traditionally. Was never Trump. Hasn't doesn't have the same level of disdain for the other Republicans who have gone along with Trump that maybe your Bulwark people do, right? Like those people might like Nikki Haley, but that's 5% of the primary.
I was actually going to ask about that. I specifically wanted to ask about like the difference between the Bulwark and the Dispatch, and not how they view Trump, because I think they're both pretty clear on how they feel about Trump, but how they feel about someone like DeSantis. Like, is there a difference, you think, between kind of the never Trump crowd and in terms of do they view DeSantis as a good thing or a bad thing? Bulwark versus Dispatch versus whoever else might be out there?
They're probably slightly different. I think they'll probably, different people are of different views at the Dispatch, so I don't want to speak for everybody over there. I think that I would describe the difference more generally as I think that the Dispatch is hopeful that there will be a post-Trump future, that they can be part of a conservative coalition that brings back some sanity to the party. I like when I went on their podcast and me and Steve Hayes got into a little tiff, but it was a good natured tiff about this where, Hayes was basically on the side of, we needed good people around in the Trump administration, right? It's better to have people involved who are, closet normals or are well-intentioned than it is to just completely cede the party to the loons. And I was kind of on the side of, I think the party is.
I love him using the closet analogy there.
Yeah.
That's what we have to be ashamed about now.
I think that's actually a Jonah Goldberg line. I'm sort of fusing the Hayes and Goldberg position, but and I was of the party of the position that, and I think most people, the Bulwark, again, not speaking for every single person, is that's like the loons have already taken over the party, right? And to participate in it is only to embolden them and empower them and be a collaborator with them. And so, as you look to how do those two worldviews look to a long term? I just think that on our side of it, it's more this entire pool is contaminated at this point, and I don't have a lot of hope that what comes out of the other side will be that much better. Maybe it'll be marginally better. I think that everybody on both websites, maybe I guess I can't speak for every single person. If our vote was the one that decided between Ron DeSantis and Trump, we'd go with DeSantis just to get rid of him because he's such a unique and existential threat. But if I did that, I wouldn't have very much or any hope that like a Ron DeSantis party would look very much like what I wanted the party to look like. Which had more of a classically liberal bent. More pluralistic bent. That's obviously not where Ron DeSantis is going, right? And so I think that is the basic dividing line. A lot of times there's the what's the old line about small differences? About people that have small differences sometimes can get much more heated arguments than people that have the larger differences because of that. I think it is a narrow reed that separates us, but an important one.
There's a line I love about why are academic fights so bitter between like professors? Well, it's because the stakes are so small.
Yeah. The narcissism of small differences is the phrase I was looking at. You get very attached to the one line where you're different than someone else. So I think that's the situation there. They're not really. It's interesting, I guess, to some people, the never Trump navel gazing. It's not really that relevant at all to this broader part of our discussion, though, which is the DeSantis and Trump war, because most of the rank and file never Trumpers, I think this is, I guess, a more important thing to understand, are ostensibly Democrats. Now, not all, right? Like if you're talking about actual voters, if you live in, Denver, where I grew up, right? Suburban Denver, my home district has gone from like Republican +10 to Democratic +10 in 10 years, just as a general rule of thumb. So like those people that live in suburban Denver used to vote Republican, like they've switched for the most part.
I got to give a shout out to the Colorado Democratic Party, best Democratic Party in the country.
And Jared Polis is doing a great job. And so, but that's true in Atlanta. That's true in a lot of places, right? Now, there is a remaining remnant, if you will, inside of people that stayed, that still see themselves as very conservative, but just had a unique problem with Trump. And that group, is, I guess, somewhat relevant going forward in the Republican Party, but they're literally 4%, right? They're a subsection of the 10% that I was talking about earlier. So it's a very non-relevant segment when it comes to like thinking about who's going to win the Republican Party war, internal war.
So if you are DeSantis and if you are Trump, and the primary is starting, obviously at some point you both kind of start attacking each other, promoting your own positions. If you're Trump, what do you want the primary to be about? And if you're DeSantis, what do you want the primary to be about?
Yeah. If you're Trump, you want the party to be about your successes perceived, right? I would rank Trump as the worst president in history, if not in the bottom 3. So I don't feel like he has a whole lot to hang his hat on there. But the perception among Republican voters, and I think this speaks to the weakness right now of the Republican establishment's argument against Trump. For everyone from Paul Ryan, all the way over to your most conservative person that has spoken out, Laura Ingraham or whatever, who said maybe it's time to move on from Trump. That everyone in that entire demographic breakdown or ideological breakdown, excuse me. Their argument right now against Trump is the same, right? That like we're losing with him, he's a loser, we can't have him, right? So that leaves Trump with a very big opening, right? None of them are arguing Trump did a bad job. Like Trump is losing because his ideas are wrong, or because his policies were wrong, or because his stewardship of the country is wrong. So if you're
it's something he's like uniquely vulnerable to the loser argument because his whole thing is that I'm a winner, you have to win with me. And if he doesn't have the argument that you win with me, if someone else can successfully argue you lose with me, like it seems like he's uniquely vulnerable there because his whole argument is that he's a winner.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen his vulnerability bear out by the fact that he hasn't gotten as many endorsements as he thought, and this could have been a thing had Republicans did better in the midterms, or Trump. I'm not even on this podcast because Trump has it all wrapped up, basically, and they're just planning the coronation. So I think that. But I think he's kind of already suffered all those losses, right? To get over to the next batch of people that you need to get of MAGA voters, you need to convince them that you can be better, right? That not only can you win, but you can do a good job. If Trump has these people convinced that he did a great job, that the country went to shit after him, inflation went up, gas prices went up, crime went up, Afghanistan is a debacle, Ukraine's a debacle, Sleepy Joe Biden is being, controlled by the squad as a puppet, or, whatever they believe as a Fox News watcher. What is the argument for moving against DeSantis besides, he can just win more? It's an important argument. Is that enough to get you to 50+1? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly, I think that there's certainly some weaknesses in that argument. If you're Trump on stage, like, you want to go back to John McCain and Mitt Romney era, and Ron DeSantis is going to have the Mitt Romney people around him and all these losers, and I was the only one that could actually win in 2016, and I won in 2020, but they stole it from me, right? I mean, that's where you want to be if you're Trump, which is, I did a great job, everything I did was great, best president ever, and they stole it from me, and now, the establishment's coming for me again. I think that's a compelling argument with the Republican base. It's not for me. I assume not for any of the listeners of this podcast, but for the Republican base, that's a compelling argument. And I think that is where, if you're DeSantis, your argument is more process right now, and you want the argument to be about process, that he's a loser, he's lost, etc. But is that enough? I don't think so. I think that's why DeSantis is going to have to layer on something else, which is not only was he electoral loser, but policy-wise, he was a loser. He gave in to Fauci too much. He didn't build his wall, right? And that's a dicey prospect. But I think that that's where he's going to have to go. I don't know that it's a winning primary message to say everything that Trump did was great. He just happens to be a loser. Vote for me instead. I'm going to do all the same things without losing. You need something else too.
It's a weird line that he has to walk, because the reason that Trump is being seen as a loser and that Trump is being seen as a liability and a weakness, and you've had all these people kind of speak out against him who were previously allies, who say, I'm not sure Trump should run anymore. I'm not sure we should just move on, I think. But the reason that's happening is because of his positions about the stolen election and like just his unique toxicity. And DeSantis kind of has to paint himself as like, look, Trump is too toxic and Trump is, too crazy. And I'll be Trump, but without the craziness. That's what he wants. But he can't actually come out and say, like, Trump is a lunatic who thinks the election was stolen and he's just lying. Like, he can't say that because that pisses off an important part of the Republican base.
Right.
So he has to, like, paint this vague picture of Trump being toxic and a loser without really explaining why, other than just it's kind of the vibes we all know.
Right. And this is his pickle, because going back to that 10-30-60 breakdown, if his base is the 60, that's a pretty good place to be, of people that like Trump but might be ready to move on. If you criticize him too much, right, you can slide from 60 down to 10 pretty quick, right? I think there's a pretty steep drop off.
Is the opposite also true, though? Like, one of the things I've seen is, Trump has started his attacks on DeSantis. It's already kind of begun. But I've seen, like, a lot of people, and this includes not just, like, I hate to call them establishment, but people like Laura Ingraham or Sean Hannity or whatever, but even the more, like, internet-y, like, Candace Owens and, like, I don't know, there's not Candace Owens specifically, but that level of person, that level of just dipshit Twitter personality, even they looked at the attack on DeSantis and were like, I'm not feeling that. Like, that doesn't land with me. When Trump attacked DeSantis, nobody rallied around him to also dogpile DeSantis. The reaction seemed to be a shrug. And I'm wondering, like, is DeSantis actually in pretty good with the Trump voter, even with the 30%? Like, they, for years, have liked DeSantis. He was the example of, like, this is our next great guy.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think he started with a good base with them and a good likability, and probably better than Pence. So this isn't a direct analogy, but just if you look at Pence, none of the people that you're talking about dogged Pence for certifying January 6th, right? I mean, all of the same people that rallied, that circled the wagons around DeSantis when Trump attacked him, circled the wagons around Pence on January 6th, and the voters were like, no. I don't care, right? He didn't stand up for Mr. Trump. So I'm not saying that I'm predicting DeSantis going down to Pence's level, which is probably low double digits or high single digits at this point. But I think it's a tightrope that he has to walk, and it's a risk. And over the course of a long primary, is how much can he criticize Trump without losing altitude with those folks, and it remains to be seen. And I think that Trump has doing well with people that supported Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio last time isn't enough, right? And so, like, that's DeSantis's low hanging fruit, and I think that he will eat that fruit pretty quickly. How do you get into people that voted for Trump last in 2016? And maybe there'll be some, but I think that's kind of the bigger question.
Do you think that there's danger of the field being too crowded in the same way it was in 2016, where you had, Trump initially was getting like 30% of the vote, 25 to 30% across the first 4 or 5 states, I think. And just there's this whole slew of other candidates between Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz and John Kasich and all sorts of other. Ben Carson existed at some point, and just nobody could actually build momentum to beat him because of how divided the field was. Do you think that there's any dynamic that could play out like that in this time, or is it more clear this time? Like, pretty much we're all going to agree to get behind DeSantis as the Republicans who don't like Trump.
Yeah, this is the one piece of Beltway conventional wisdom that I just reject about 2016. I think Trump would have beaten everybody one-on-one. I don't think there's any evidence that the divided field was the reason Trump won. Trump absolutely annihilated Marco one-on-one in his home state of Florida. Ted Cruz cleared out of Florida. John Kasich is kind of a prick, so he didn't, but I still think he only got like 6%. So if Trump got about 45% of the vote every time somebody dropped out, his vote share increased. I reject that theory for 2016. I think in theory, in 2024, that could be a problem, but it's not one that I'm particularly worried about. I think that the type of person that beats Trump, if DeSantis is going to beat Trump, he's going to have to get up into the mid to high 40s. I do not see a situation where Trump is the nominee getting 30% of the vote and Ron DeSantis getting 28%, and all these other dwarves that you just mentioned, like combining for whatever the remaining 32% is. I just 38%. I don't see that as a problem. I think DeSantis will use the misunderstanding of what happened in 2016 to kind of scare some of these other people off, and donors will do that to scare some of these other people off. And so you never know. I don't think that's like a 0% chance, but I think that is a low likelihood event for Trump coming out of the nomination. I think it's a much more higher likelihood event that he actually just wins again, 45+% of the vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't figure out how it's going to go, to be honest. There's a couple scenarios I can see, but DeSantis is going to struggle, at least for a little bit, because he has to kind of attack Trump or be the alternative to Trump without being explicit about why Trump is bad. Right. It's got to be just the vibes are bad with Trump, and even explicitly criticizing him as a loser, you don't really want to do that because you don't want to piss off the Trump base. Right. Whereas Trump is going to attack DeSantis and has already started, but it's that question, I think you phrased it like, has he lost his fastball? Right. He was really on the moment when he criticized Rubio, and he just went after Ted Cruz's wife and father, because nobody likes Ted Cruz, and he beat up on people who people wanted to see be beat up. But has he lost the fastball? Is nobody in the conservative crowd going to jump when he gives Ron DeSantis a little name, a nickname or whatever, Little Ronnie or whatever? And by the way, my pet theory is that Ron DeSantis is actually too short to be president, but we'll see if that holds up. Ron DeSantis is kind of a little guy. I don't know.
He is. Yeah,
it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't, but we've had a lot of tall presidents. We
have had a lot of tall presidents, and standing on stage next to each other, it will be noticeable. So yeah, I think that then you also get into a general election territory where if DeSantis does beat Trump fair and square, is Trump going to behave? It's hard to see Trump speaking at his convention. Will DeSantis want Trump to speak at his convention? Will he be doing what he did in Georgia in the runoff in 2020 and sabotaging the Republican side? I just think that there are a lot of pitfalls ahead for Ron DeSantis, and that it looks really nice right now, and he's as political situation, you can paint a picture that's about as rosy as you've ever been able to paint for him today. But that's because he hasn't had to deal with a lot of things that are gonna complicate it.
All right, bonus question, not about Trump, not about DeSantis. Mitch McConnell, it's funny. Nancy Pelosi has basically said she's stepping back from leadership because she's 82 and she lost the House, and not that it was a bad performance, but it's her time. Mitch McConnell is 80 though, and he just lost the Senate that he was expected to win, and he's not stepping back. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about Mitch McConnell's future? And it's funny, Rick Scott had this doomed challenge where Rick Scott seems like America's biggest idiot, and decided to challenge. He came for the king and he missed.
Badly.
So, but I don't know. What's your thoughts about what's going on with McConnell? Because it seems to me to be an undercovered. Everybody's talking about Pelosi. Everybody's talking about Trump versus DeSantis. McConnell, like a turtle, is still just kind of crawling along. He's still there.
Yeah, and he's had a bad few cycles. Really bad. I mean, there's no reason that the Republicans shouldn't have the Senate majority right now. There's I guess one reason of Trump that they didn't get it in 2020. But Mitch McConnell's overseen this strategy, and this is the challenge that Ron DeSantis would have to have if he won, right? Which is he's made this bet, similar bet to DeSantis, which is I need Trump and I need his voters, but I also want to kind of wiggle away from him a little bit on some of his, most insane behaviors, particularly around election. That hasn't worked. That bet hasn't worked. They've lost every competitive election for Senate since 2020, with the exception of this Ron Johnson Mandela Barnes race in Wisconsin. Besides that, it's a total offer. And so, he doesn't have a lot on the campaign side to hang his hat on. What he does have going for him is that there's not a clear challenger to him in the Senate. And I think that the Senate colleagues think that he has done a good job of kind of managing the minority, managing the majority when they had it. And, they see him as savvy. And so, without an obvious other option, he is going to continue to survive. I think you also look ahead to a variant-friendly map in 2024 for Republicans. It's almost impossible to see how they butt fumble the Senate next time. And so maybe they stick with Mitch. But the caucus is also slowly moving away from him, which is another thing that you have to kind of realize. Senate is on a 6-year term, right? So these changes in the Republican Party have been delayed in the Senate, right? The more populist, the more MAGA candidates that have taken over the House caucus, they're slowly but surely, replacing the old men in the Senate. But the slowly part has allowed Mitch to hold on to his grasp.
Yeah, it's frightening to me in a way that the way in which certain Republicans become moderate over time,
right.
Like
I think not you mentioned being conspiracy theorists.
I think you mentioned Paul Ryan as one of them earlier, and I remember when Paul Ryan was the Tea Party firebrand, right. Who wanted to overthrow the establishment in Washington, and he was gonna, and with him, obviously, it's more of this, turn the federal government into a series of block grants kind of thing,
right?
But he is a much more fiscal taxes kind of guy. But there's no real world in which Paul Ryan is a moderate politically. And yet in today's Republican Party, he's almost so moderate as to be unelectable. And that cycle seems to keep going. I don't know.
I don't know if that's true, actually. So if you're Paul Ryan, I mean, sure, I take your point that he's not moderate in the sense of he did not have a moderate temperament towards dealing with fiscal issues, et cetera. But if you pretend that Paul Ryan is not Paul Ryan, right, and that he is Paul Jones, and that he lives in Cleveland, and he's a tax accountant, and he thinks that the federal government should be turned into block grants, but is also kind of a globalist and for immigration and believes climate change is real at some level, maybe the government shouldn't do anything about it. You're a swing voter right now. You're a very soft Republican. You might have voted for Mike DeWine and Tim Ryan in this last election because you looked at J.D. Vance and were like, you're a lunatic. I hear what you're saying, but in the way that things have been rejiggered in our politics, somebody that has that, the whole cliche, about being a fiscal conservative and a social liberal, and not that Paul Ryan's a total social liberal, but a fiscal conservative and a social moderate, or someone who lives in reality on these issues, that does at this right now make you one of the groups of swing voters in our electorate.
All right, so we're coming up on time now, and I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast. What would you recommend people read if they want to learn more? And as always, this could be books that you think are relevant to what we've been talking about. This could be someone to follow on Twitter, a particular blog. I'll go ahead and say that Tim Miller has a fine book called Why We Did It that you should absolutely purchase. It's available at any bookseller. But anything else you'd recommend to people who are interested in just the topic of what's going on in the Republican Party right now and the civil war that might be coming?
Well, I want to start by saying that one of the things that I read as a lurker is the Neoliberal subreddit. Just want to let you guys know and shout you guys out. I've been trying, as Twitter is dying, maybe, I've been trying to repopulate some of our Bulwark superfans over to Reddit. We do have the Bulwark subreddit, and I would love for some of you to just moonlight over there and, troll our people or, engage in dialogue. I'm sure we have some overlap already, but I think that there's probably some additional overlap that could,
We'll have to get you to the Neoliberal subreddit. You can do a Ask Me Anything.
Yeah. We should do some sort of crossover on the subreddit. I love the subreddit.
I'm sure they'd love to have you. Yeah.
On this topic. So Robert Draper, my friend, wrote a book called Weapons of Mass Delusion. If you don't want to read a full book, which, and I'm not discouraging you for buying his book, but it was good. But the best parts that he explored in the book was also in a very lengthy New York Times Magazine profile he wrote on Arizona and about Paul Gosar, about what is happening in the Arizona Republican Party. He wrote before the election, so I think that there were a lot of maybe red flags and warning signs about the just horrible night that the Republican Party of Arizona was going to have. So that would be my top recommendation. Have you had my man on the ideological side? I feel like I'm on the Neoliberal Podcast. I have to shout out Francis Fukuyama's Liberalism and Its Discontents. Have you guys had Francis on? You should.
You know, it's funny. I'm actually in the middle. I'm reading 3 of his books right now. I've finished 2 of them. My plan is to finish the 3rd and then to invite him on, because just about like 3 or 4 months ago, he followed us on Twitter.
Oh, great. So I might get credit for that. I told him, I interviewed him at the Commonwealth Club here in San Francisco. So I also had to binge a bunch of his books recently. And I thought that it was nice because it was like, I'm a hack. And I went to GW and did political science and like literally took the most hacky campaign classes that I could, like the politics of advertisements and polling crosstabs and all, like those are all the classes I took. So I took fewer actual political theory classes than I probably should. And I felt like liberalism is discontents were like, I solved an entire semester just by reading it. It's very accessible. So
it's an interesting book. I have my quibbles with it just because I feel like he does the thing where he's like, well, neoliberal globalism occurred at the same time as some of these things, and therefore it caused them. And then there's like not a ton of argument actually talking about why. But, it's kind of more of an accusation than a well-built theory in some sense. I
don't disagree with that. I'd love to hear you guys exchange on it, so I'll be a listener. So my final plug just has to be for my colleague, though. Jonathan Last, it writes The Triad. It's a daily newsletter for The Bulwark that is just fantastic. And it's so hard to write a daily newsletter and to have every day have it be interesting. And I'm sure you guys already read, Iglesias and Sullivan and some of the other ones that have a little bit more, name brand recognition. But I feel like JVL's is as good, if not better, than all of them day in, day out. And some of those aren't daily. So that would be my final plug. Draper, JVL, and Fukuyama.
All right. Well, my guest today has been Tim Miller. Once again, he has a book out, Why We Did It. You can find him on The Bulwark. Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.